And let me first introduce our conversationalist extraordinaire, Mike Gousha. Has, of course, been a senior advisor in law and public policy at Marquette Law School. That was after his storied career at WTMJ as a lead anchor. He was host of Sunday Night. He's been a documentarian. You know him. He's fabulous. And he is here tonight to do some conversationalizing with our guest of honor, Brian Reisinger. Brian is a Wisconsin native. He's a Journal Sentinel columnist. He's written for WPR's Wisconsin Life, so the USA Today Network. He's written for the Wisconsin State Journal, the Cap Times, and so many more. I could go on. I will stop. Serves as president and chief content officer. Let me say that again. Prove I can read here. Serves as president and chief content officer of Platform Communications, and he's here tonight with his book, Land Rich, Cash Poor: My Family's Hope and the Untold History of the Disappearing American Farmer. Some words that have been tossed around in reviews of this book include dramatic, engrossing, relentless, rich, lyrical, remarkable, fascinating, informative, compelling, important, infuriating, heartbreaking, and beautiful. Please give them both a warm welcome.
Thanks to Chris. Thanks to all of you for being here tonight. So good to see everyone for this event. And thanks to Boswell for being Milwaukee's favorite bookstore, Milwaukee's local bookstore. So congratulations on all your success over the years. That's terrific. I'm honored to be here tonight with Brian, who has written just a terrific book. I've had the chance to read it, which is always good for an interview of this kind. But
not required, by the way.
But you'll find as you go on your book tour that that's not always the case. But it's a very powerful story, very poignant, and so congratulations on what you've done here. How long were you thinking about writing this book?
You know, in some ways, I guess it's all my life. And what I mean by that is people who grow up on a farm like we did, even as kids in the 90s, it was a good middle class living that my parents provided us. But you always had the sense that, you know, the farms were going by the wayside, kids getting on the bus from dormant farms. You had the sense that something was slipping away. And so in that way, part of this book has been with me for a very long time. I've been thinking about it for about a decade. After I left Wisconsin and I went to Nashville, I was working as a business journalist then. This is before I got into public policy, went to an even crazier place called Washington, D.C. And I was in Nashville and people were talking about, this is in the banking industry, and people were talking about the good years and the bad years. And they were referring to some years that had been in economic recovery, the good years. And I thought, well, why in the hell were the good years? I couldn't, you know, I didn't know what they were talking about. And I realized that the big things going on in our economy from a macroeconomic standpoint, everything that was happening, I didn't understand what was going on and what had happened to our way of life. And then I realized that people from outside of where I grew up didn't know what was going on to our farms. And I thought there must be a way to put those two things together. And so about 2 years ago, I got serious about doing that with this project. And the idea was, why is it that we went from having farm families like my grandpa able to climb out of poverty into the middle class during the depths of the Great Depression, and then in modern day America, farms struggling to make ends meet? How could that be? So we started looking at every decade and trying to find a hidden history beneath the surface of each decade to try to figure out why that was. And the lucky thing for me was that I found that the things going on in each of those hidden histories lined up with something that our family had gone through. Now, there were good things and there were bad things and difficult things and joyous things, but I was amazed to see how much of this history we'd lived. And so that kind of brought it full circle, and that's what got us here.
It's a very, very personal book. It is the story of Brian's family, some of whom are here tonight. Delighted that you're here. But it also provides a lot of analysis of the current state of the American farmer. And I thought we might begin tonight, and we'll do this at several points of the evening. We'll have Brian read from the book. And I thought maybe we could begin there, Brian. This is really sort of your assessment of where we are, where the American farmer is in the year 2024. And I'll let you read, and if you need to set it up in any better than that, feel free.
I'm going to ask if you remember the page number that we were going to do on the
Page 5.
See, this is why we have Mike Gousha here. This is why you know this isn't too scripted, because you can see him leading me through this here. And we were going to start with rather than, and then we were going to go. Yeah. Rather than a mix of large, mid-sized, and small farms all playing a competitive role in the market, America's small farms and mid-sized farms, and even some of its larger farms, have faced economic ruin and fallen into bankruptcy or sales of necessity. Meanwhile, America is continuing to see ever larger farms buying up smaller farms to keep up with a food industry dominated by far bigger companies. And those bigger companies, in turn, are trying to keep up with larger growing companies in other parts of our economy and domestic and global demand. Such loss in the number of farms is part of a food supply chain that is less durable against disaster, less sustainable, and less secure because our farms are disappearing. It's the compromise of our most fundamental form of economic security, food security for every American. While it is a problem rooted in rural America, evidence of its effect is spreading from coast to coast, carrying a myriad of other economic and cultural problems in its wake. In farm country, the pummeling pace of farms vanishing has not been limited by geography or industry. It's a devastating hollowing out of rural America, reverberating across the country at various periods and in often brutal ways as family farms and ranches disappear, nostalgia the only monument left in their honor.
Let's put some numbers on what you just told us and what you just read to us. How many American farms have disappeared in the last century or so?
Yeah, from the early 1920s, when my great-grandpa got here, when we were having more and more farms in this country, it's hard to believe there were a growing number of farms at that time, to today, we've lost over 4 million farms. So we have about 2 million left. And for those keeping score at home, that's 70% of our farms have been wiped out in a century. That averages 45,000 farms on average per year.
Those are the mid-size and small farmers, basically.
For the most part, the mid-size and the small farmers, and the definition of what's a mid-size and a small farm has changed as we go too.
And in the state of Wisconsin, we like to think so fondly of our farming heritage. It is so much part of who we are. But the dairy farming industry has been decimated over the years. What has happened to dairy farming in Wisconsin?
Yeah, farms like the one I grew up on that my mom and dad worked when we were growing up, and that my sister has been working with my dad to take over for a couple of years here. When we were a dairy farm, we sold our herd in spring of 2021. But when we were a dairy farm, when I was growing up, 50 cows was a little on the small side, but about medium sized. The mid size for a farm, dairy farm in the late 80s was about 80 cows. We had about 50. Today, the mid size is more like 1,200 cows. So that's how that has changed. That's the kind of economic change and economic scale we're talking about. And that's one of the reasons it's an example of why it's a window into why it's so difficult for so many farms to make it.
You said in the book that Wisconsin led the country in milk products, but now it leads in farm bankruptcies.
Yeah, it was an incredible change, and it happened really in our generation. As my parents' generation was working to hand the farm over to our generation, this is what happened in this country, and it's things outside of any one farmer's control that occurred. And dairy farming in Wisconsin actually was one of the more durable forms of family farming in this country for a long time. Other types of farming we talked about in just that passage had long since, pigs, chickens, all kinds of different types of farming had long since shifted toward much bigger farms. Dairy farming had held on longer. There's a lot of reasons for that have to do with the regional economy, that have to do with the hard work of our Wisconsin farmers, have to do with the way that we have our rural regional economy set up. But dairy was destined to fall too in that way. And so dairy was really the last piece. As I looked at what's happened to our farms over the past century, it happened in so many different ways. Dairy was one of the last ones that held on. Wisconsin was one of the last ones that held on. So the downside of that, the terrible part about that, is that Wisconsin has been ground zero for the latest stage of this crisis. The incredible part about that is that Wisconsin farmers have been more resilient than any farmers in the country. And that's part of the reason that Wisconsin, while leading in farm bankruptcies, also still leads in cheese production. And there's still a lot of signs of hope that reside here in Wisconsin too. So, both come with.
Talk about your family's farm in just a moment, but I was struck by the passage you read earlier. And you talked about our current food supply system being less durable, less sustainable, and more vulnerable to disaster. Can you talk to that? Talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and that ties to something that I think people all across the spectrum of viewpoints care about. It ties to why are food prices so much higher and rise so much quicker than inflation. Everyone's debating inflation. There's ideas that people have on different ends of the political spectrum for that, but food prices, independent of inflation, are rising far faster than that rate of inflation, and it's tied to this issue. It's tied to environmental issues. It's tied to all kinds of problems that a lot of people from different walks would care about. But the reason that the vulnerability to disaster occurs is because we have fewer pathways from the farm gate to the dinner table. So there was a time where people bought food from the farmers that they knew down the street. Of course, we're not in those times. Things are a bit different now. The international and national food supply chains that we have are in some ways a modern miracle, and they're able to accomplish things that you couldn't have done in terms of just buying locally. Think about all the foods that you buy from different parts of the country that are possible. That's a good thing. That's advancement for people, and it's also been a smaller part of household incomes. But the flip side is that it's gone too far. How many people really, if they had to, could get the food that they needed by going down to a local farm, or a farmer's market? It's pretty hard to do. And the reality is that if we had a way to have people able to buy food from our regular national and international distribution chains and to be able to buy food in a diversified way from local farms, would be much more durable against disaster. COVID was a perfect example, but it's not the only example. And that's the danger of COVID, that people think, well, that was just a one-time thing. Whether it was the spread of COVID or whether it was the reaction to COVID that kind of shut down parts of our economy, or a combination thereof, what we saw was we had this tragic time where farmers were desperately looking for a place to sell their goods, and consumers were desperately trying to find food that they needed in the stores, and it wasn't happening because the supply chain was blocked up. So you had milk getting dumped, you had animals getting slaughtered, you had produce going to waste, and you had people in the grocery store not able to find the food they wanted, and when they could find it, it was more expensive. And that's a travesty.
Yeah, you called it a food system catastrophe. And that's sort of what COVID did. But on the other hand, as you point out in the book, and we'll get to this later, COVID laid bare some of the vulnerabilities and made us think, or hopefully will make us think, about solutions to some of the issues we're talking about. Tell us about the Reisinger family farm. I want to get personal here for a moment. Tell us about, for people in this room who don't know where it is and how big it is, tell us a little bit about your family's farm.
Well, our farm's in the driftless area, and so that means there's plenty of hills to drive over and get in ditches and all kinds of trouble to get into that way. There's a couple stories of tractors in the
You never
book.
did that, I assume.
No, never. We're in Sauk County, an hour west of Madison, southern Wisconsin. And the farm started when my great-grandpa escaped war-torn Europe to come to this country and find a better life. And he found, my dad calls it down in that hole. He found a valley. You couldn't have found a spot more remote, more deep, and it really is down in a hole, down in a valley. But it's a beautiful valley. And he found a place there in part because he didn't want to go fight for World War I. He was supposed to go back. He was from Bavaria. He was supposed to go back to Germany. And he was supposed to fight if World War I broke out. He didn't want to. He wanted to build a better life in America. So he found a farm that was as remote and tucked down in a hole as you could possibly find. And they survived those early years of subsistence farming. And then that turned the page toward my grandpa, Albert, who climbed out of poverty into the middle class in the depths of the Great Depression in that same farm. And the farm has since expanded a little bit. And the farm that we have now, it's all part of the same contiguous land, but the farm we have is up on a hill. And so we grew up on a farm that's up on a hill in the rolling hills of southern Wisconsin. And it's the most beautiful place to see the sunrise and the sunset you could imagine.
Your book, one of the things I love about the book is you can see what a magical place this is for you and for members of your family. And I think that's a really sweet part of the book. Maybe have you read a section about when you were a young boy. You said your first childhood memories on the farm, I think you were 3 years old. And this, the passage I think Brian's going to read is really sort of about how he viewed life and what he learned during his playing. Do you need the page number? Do you want me to get that out?
We'll settle into a routine here before this is over with.
I would say, Brian, that you need to go to page 122.
22. Yeah, as Mike said, this is a scene in the barn that I can remember with my dad, where first thing I remember with my dad is him wheeling this wheelbarrow up and down the manger of our barn. Big load of corn. He thought nothing to have his 3-year-old boy sitting on top of the corn pile, helping him out with chores. And so when I say I learned how to work with my dad from the time I could walk, it's actually I learned to work from him before I could walk. And then I began working with him once I could get up on my own 2 feet. And the same thing was true of my sister. So we're in the barn and this is talking about that. And then Mike, we'll go to the end of the section. Okay. This is where we learned about the world. Me and my sister too, after she came along, working with our dad in whatever way our little hands could muster in the barn and the farmyard. laughing as he hung us from the barn beams by our pants, screaming as he squirted us with milk from a cow's udder, begging him, as he tried to get his work done, to tie us up with baler twine just one more time, to show him how we could escape no matter how tight he pretended to bind us. Watching as he and my mom did chores and tested milk quality and talked about crops together, drinking whole milk from a pitcher my mom dipped straight from the bulk tank in the milk house, then carried to our kitchen table where breakfast was waiting for us all to eat together. Coming back to the barn at the oddest of hours to help pull a calf if its mother was struggling in labor, feeling it slide to the ground, my dad clearing its mouth and nostrils and watching, waiting to see if it would take its first breath or fall lifeless. Come on, God dang you, he'd say. Come on now. We learned too, in the fields beyond the farmyard where my dad would drive his old pickup, down through the valley, up onto sunny slopes where he had mowed rows of hay to make. Reaching down, he'd feel the fallen alfalfa with his hands, then look at the sky, deciding when it would be dry enough for him to come back through with the tractor to bale or trap his latest crop. Work and weather and life and death. We learned each of these lessons. There in the dreams and safety of childhood, and each was destined to slip not only into the realities of adulthood, as all things do, but also into the peril of a vanishing way of life. This would be true no matter how badly we might wish it weren't so, and laid bare with a harsh honesty as my sister and I took our different paths that began in a neverland that would one day depart from its natural law and disappear before our eyes.
It's beautifully written, and it does capture, I think, the magic that you describe. But life on the farm is hard too. There's a passage, and I won't ask you to read it tonight, but there's a passage where you talk about your dad's experience at the age of 8. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, something I learned is that every generation on a farm has their moment when they have to step up. And it's at different times and in different ways. But when you are trying to keep a farm going, you're not just fighting for your job, you're fighting for your home, your community, your way of life, your heritage. And every generation has a moment when they start to feel that weight. And my dad, I learned in the course of this book that it was at the age of 8. And my grandpa Albert had been climbing around on a corn crib trying to replace the top cap of a corn crib that blown off in the winter. And the wind was blowing and it was bitter cold, and he was climbing rung by rung to get up to the top of the corn crib. And he got to that smooth metal steel top there, and he was reaching out to get it, and he slipped, and he went right off the edge of the corn crib, and he fell 30 feet through the air onto the frozen ground and broke his back. And I see my dad tearing up. I'm going to have a hard time getting through this myself. My dad, at the tender age of 8, was made to step up, and he milked cows, and he did all the chores in the barn of a man, and he began working in the fields, and he'd helped out feeding calves and everything. Every kid is doing that from the time they could walk on a farm, but he stepped up and started doing man's work, and it was him and my grandma who really carried the farm forward while the man of the house was lay crippled in bed. And the scene in the book where we talk about this is my dad pushed through the curtains as an 8-year-old and saw his father lying there. And I think about that. And I think about the fact that my dad is now 72 years old, still working, still in the back of a tractor because he loves it, but also because of the weight of that. And, you know, been doing that for more than 60 years. And it really gets down in your blood and your bones. And the good and the bad, the joy and the beauty of the work of living close to the land, and the weight of that comes down in each generation, those two things are tied together no matter what you do.
I ask you about your decision because it was hard. Farming is not for everyone, and it, at least full-time farming, was not for you ultimately. How hard was that decision for you to make, Brian? Because you were the first child, you were the son. What was that like?
That was one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life, and I still carry it around. And I'm thankful that my dad and mom are farming. I'm thankful that my sister's there, working with my dad and doing something I didn't have the talent for. But growing up, it was very clear that I had more talent for words than I did cattle and crops. And whether it was the wrecked tractors or whether it was the animals that didn't take to me like they did my dad, there's some funny moments in the book. There's some hard moments in the book about that, but it was just something that I knew as I went along. And you know, I had my moment where I felt the weight of the next generation when I was 14. My dad became sick with some internal bleeding, and I'm more thankful than anything that I did the work that winter, before and after school, to keep the farm going, working with a guy who came to help our family out. But it was also the year that I realized I wouldn't farm. And it was incredibly hard. And I was the first, I was the first child in our family to go to college. I was also the first eldest son in 4 generations to not take over the farm. And I felt like I was letting my dad down. Um, and I still feel like that on my bad days. On my good days, I remind myself that my gifts are elsewhere. And it's a real weight that you feel like you see your parents carrying this way of life on. And then when you don't do that directly, you feel like you failed.
Your story, though, in some ways is kind of emblematic of the challenges facing farming. In the book, you talk about the vanishing labor force that began really in the 1940s and has continued since, that a lot of young folks don't see farming as their future. That makes it really hard. Thankfully, in your family's case, your sister has seen farming as the future. And so she and your dad and your mom keep the farm going. But you're helping out too. We should make that clear.
Yeah, I help out on the business side. So I work in a day job in communications and writing, and then do my own writing, and then on the side I also help out on the business side of the farm. I'm grateful to be able to chance to do that. They do throw me in a tractor now and then, even though I had my larger than my share of tractor accidents growing up. When I'm home and I'm on a day off, we'll jump in the tractor and I'll help out in the fields, or I'll help out my sister or my dad with chores, and it's a joy to be able to do that.
And you said to me on the phone the other day that you find that when you go back there, there is something special about that place, and it just feeds the soul to this day.
Yeah, despite how much of it has disappeared and despite how hard it's been, the thing that I think of first, I don't think of the people say, how can anybody do that kind of work, and I don't think about that. I can remember hard times. I can remember the difficult work. I remember picking rock by hand in the field before my dad got a rock picker to pull behind the tractor. But I also can remember, waking up in the morning, coming down to chores and hearing my dad with just one whistle, the cow dog running out into the pasture to bring the cows in. I can remember, the way it smelled and the way it felt and the way it sounded when my sister and I and our friends would sit in the back of my dad's truck and we would yell 85, wanting him to take the truck up to 85 miles an hour because that was the biggest number on the speedometer, and he'd push it up to maybe 40, and we'd scream for him to slow down, and hunting with my dad and driving across the land just to look at it at night. It's a special thing, and it's something that I'm so glad we get the chance to witness firsthand. It's central to our country because it impacts our food supply, and the howling out of rural America is affecting every single American dinner table. It's also central to our country because I think people know it's part of our identity. There's a reason that more than 70% of the American public has trust in family farms. I don't know anybody that pulls 70%. With all due respect, I don't think journalists pull at 70%. I know writers, I know consultants don't pull at 70%. Farmers do. And so people know that this is a part of who we are. And so there's beauty to that, but the fact that we're losing that means that we're also losing a part of ourselves. And I'm grateful to have had the chance to witness that firsthand. And it's part of why I'm so grateful to be able to talk about these issues.
Talk in just a moment about the farm today and sort of the direction that the Reisinger family has taken to keep the farm alive, to keep it going, moving forward. But before we do that, I want to talk about one of the hardest days for your family. And that was as you decided how you were going to proceed, how you were going to move forward, there was a decision made that you had to sell the dairy cows. You couldn't be a dairy farmer anymore. And it didn't make financial sense anymore. And there is a beautiful section of the book where you describe the day that the trailers came to take the milk cows away. I wonder if you might read from that. Do you need a page number again? You okay?
No, I thought I was going to get ahead of you here. I'm very close. I think I got it. Here we go. I've got it.
You got it? Okay.
Yeah, as Mike said, and I'll give this a little context, as Mike said, this is the day that we sold our cows. And the decision we made to sell our cows, it feels like a death when you do that. I'm glad to say it wasn't a death for our farm. We have sold the dairy herd because the scale of dairy farming was such that a smaller herd, we would have either had to take out a bunch of debt to get way bigger and further from our animals, or we had to change. So we changed. And so we're working on diversifying the farm. And my sister and dad, they raise custom heifers for other dairy herds, meaning they raise milk cows that go to other farms. they raise beef for consumers, and they raise cash crops. And so we're diversifying, and we're in some ways returning to our early agricultural roots of mixed agriculture. But to do that, we had to sell the herd, and it's a really, really difficult thing to do. So this is the day that that's happening, and we're loading the cows, and it's kind of a chaotic scene with the noise of the animals loading, and it's a difficult thing. And the cows, they kept on turning back. They kept on going back into the barn like they didn't want to leave. So this is what's happening as I look back here to my dad. I turned amid the struggle and saw my dad standing in the back. He had started his morning walking up and down this very barn driveway, his hands clasped behind his back, weeping over his final moments with his cows. And he had returned again after, weeping over their absence. Yet, in that moment, as the cows bellered and the handlers yelled and the trailers sounded, he watched quietly, declining to join in this task of loading his cattle. It was perhaps the one chore he had ever accepted in all his life. It was not for him to do. Instead, he stood there in solidarity with those bravest of cows that refused to go. After the loading, we stood in the yard to watch the trailers go down the road. It was the same spot where great-grandpa Alice's machinery had clattered past after he sold the lower farm in the valley, and where Grandpa Albert had looked as a young man out the window of the farmhouse before he left for morning chores with booze coursing in his veins. Now it would forever be the spot where my dad watched as our family's milk cows departed for good. He talked to anyone who would listen about how good the cows had done for him that day. 3,900 pounds of milk, more than almost any other day, as though they had known what was coming. But now he stood there alone, hunched in his heavy work coat, and waved an open hand to all that was lost.
I asked you to read that because I think it is such an important part of this story. We talked about the numbers earlier, and the numbers are troubling, no doubt. But what you just described is what this means to the individual farmers, what it means to the families, what it means to their lives, how much being a farmer means to them. And give us a sense of I feel like that's a less known part of the story, that we are, we just, oh, another farm disappeared. Here's 3 more today, and there'll be 3 more tomorrow. But you're talking fundamentally about changing somebody's life, a way of life. Talk a little bit about that.
Like that gets at the reason for the title of the book, Land Rich, Cash Poor. So what that refers to is the fact that farmers have this land that's so valuable. If you want to sell your farm to go get it developed into real estate, depending on the location, you might be able to make a little bit of money. It's such a valuable thing to have this land, especially when you attach to it all the emotional value that comes to it generation after generation, buying it from the prior generation. But it is getting harder and harder to make a living on that land. So that's the cash poor part. Land rich, cash poor. And you're in a situation where the only way to be able to make a living on this land is if you were to sell it. And holding on to it, which is everything to you, is the thing that makes it harder and harder for you to continue to grind out a living. And when you have land like that that was passed from generation to generation, and it's not just your job, but it's your community, it's your home, it's your livelihood, it's your heritage, it's everything, it is wrapped up in who you are. And that's one of the reasons that you hear about mental health being such an issue in the farming community. That's why you hear about the rural mental health crisis, in part, because what you have is you have farmers who have worked hard, who've done everything right, who have the most efficient operation you can imagine, who are doing their best, who can compete. And yet what they're finding is that they can either hold on to their farm and risk failing to provide for their family, or sell their farm and lose everything else.
So I guess the question is, and we do this a lot in America today, it's like, who's to blame? But that's a very complex question, isn't it? There are a lot of different forces at work here.
Yeah, there are. And they span economic upheaval that nobody could have predicted or controlled, social changes like the shift from rural to urban of our population, technological changes, government policy, a whole wide range of things. And the truth is that I unpack those in the book, and I say that we all did it in a way. And what I mean by that is there were so many things that are outside of our control, but there are also so many decisions that our country made decade after decade that made it so that it was harder for our farms to make it. The big picture nutshell is basically before the Great Depression, we had a growing number of farms in this country. That was going to end at some point because we were getting to the end of settling the country, and there's only so much land. And so over time, there was going to be some consolidation. There was always going to be some decline in the number of farms. But what happened is we hit the highest point in the number of farms in this country right before the Depression. The Depression hit, and we started wiping out our farms. And then we never stopped for the next century. Through good or bad economic times, it continued. Why? Well, the economic upheaval wiped out a lot of farms through bankruptcy and other things. But then as we went along, our economy began to get bigger and it began to get more complex. And we started to have bigger companies all across the economy, not just in ag, not just in food, but all across the economy, getting bigger to try to meet global demand and try to keep up with our more sophisticated economy. We never did anything to try to make sure that that didn't just go on forever. And so farms that are getting bigger are keeping up with agribusinesses, the buyers and suppliers of farm goods that are getting bigger. And those farms, or excuse me, those companies are keeping up with the food industry. The food industry is keeping up with every other industry in this country, and this country is keeping up with the rest of the world. And so that need for economic scale continued. And then you layer onto that more economic crises like the farm crisis that my dad and mom got through, globalization, other things. So all these economic forces. Then there was the shift of our population, as I mentioned, from rural to urban, people leaving and the workforce leaving to go to the bright lights of the city. And as I've said, I struggle with that. I'm an example of that. And we had examples of that all throughout our family's history. Then there was technology and government policy. And those are two of the areas that are most tragic in terms of they didn't have to be this way. Technology for the longest time was trying to find a way for farms to be able to take on more acres and more animals with fewer people breaking their backs to do it. That's a good thing. On some level, that's a good thing. And there's also a way to make food more affordable. And that also happened. That's also a good thing. But it went too far, and we reached a point where farm wages and factory wages in the 70s and 80s had kind of caught up with one another. So there wasn't really a need to have this technology that could help farms get bigger anymore. Nice to keep getting more productive, more efficient, but there wasn't a need for that kind of technology anymore, but nobody saw it. We missed it. So we stopped having in this country something that's called scale neutral technology. That would be where a big farm, a medium farm, or a small farm could afford to invest in a piece of technology and it would work for them and it would help them continue to innovate. We stopped doing that in this country. That happened right around the time of the farm crisis. So we got on the other end of that farm crisis and we had economic change, social change, and technological change that was working against small and medium-sized family farms when it didn't have to be that way. And the government policy is a whole different conversation, but we made choices at different points that was only geared around getting cheap food with our government policy. And cheap food is a good thing. It's a modern miracle, what it's done for our society. But it's the only thing that our government policy was really trying to do. And so over time, government policy contributed to this as well.
And you say in the book, both parties have failed the farmer really on that in terms of addressing some of these root causes.
Yeah, absolutely. You can see many examples all throughout history, but the reality is that whether it was Democrats crafting government policy, whether it was Republicans crafting government policy, there were times where the decision was made that ended up with the farmer getting the short end of the stick. And I'm not meaning to sound resentful by that. I think it's a fact. A good example is the farm crisis, where there were a lot of things that happened. One of the things that happened was that the Nixon administration negotiated to sell a whole lot of grain to the Soviet Union. And that's a good thing because farmers could sell the grain, but they were also doing it because they wanted to have leverage over the Soviets, over the communists. So if you were feeding them and you needed the Soviet Union to do something different, you could withhold food or whatever. And actually, Nixon's ag secretary said 4 fateful words: food is a weapon. And what happened later, this was wielded by both Republican and Democratic administrations. Later, it was President Jimmy Carter's administration that actually instituted that grain embargo. That's not the thing that caused the farm crisis only, but it's an example of how both parties, including through well-intentioned people who were trying to do the right thing, and in some cases, farmers might have understood those individual moves, but when you put that all together, it's clear that when food is a weapon, the farmer is the one who's in the crossfire. And so that's not to blame any of those particular people. That is to say that this is something that we found moment after moment throughout the book, where both parties in one way or another were making maybe decisions that they felt were right for national security or right for our economy in other ways, but were leaving the farmer by the wayside. Now, if you have a century of making decisions like that, whether each individual decision was right or wrong, and whatever their politics may be in this room, when you have a century of every decision by both parties pretty well going that direction and piling program after program on without thinking about how it affects the farmer, then you're contributing toward those economic and social and technological problems.
You know, I'm old enough to remember the 1980s and when you had Farm Aid and in some weird way, Brian, it feels like to me that was the last time that we as a nation really talked at length about the struggles of the American farmer. Maybe it was because Willie Nelson and John Mellencamp were playing, sold out stadium crowds, but it feels like we don't have that kind of conversation today. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that the farm crisis was the last time we really talked about it. I think during the trade war of the 2010s was another time where we talked about it some. But for the most part, we have commercials come Super Bowl time and other things that make us feel good about our farming and heritage. And that's a good thing. And it shows, again, the faith that people have in farmers. But we've really haven't had a conversation about how to change our government policy, how to address those economic trends that we can't stop or change, but maybe we don't have to make them worse, what to do with our technology to make sure that more farms can make it and have a competitive shot. We really haven't had that kind of a conversation in a very long time.
Well, I thought that'd be a good place for us to end tonight, and then we'll take about 15 minutes of questions from the audience. You do have some policy prescriptions in this book, which I think is another strength of the book. Let's talk about some of the things that could possibly find bipartisan support and could be done to improve the life of the farmer in America.
Yeah, well, what I found was that farm policy and food policy is so complicated it will defy anyone's politics. So there's no one person's politics that will fit everything that goes on there. And, at the end of the day, both parties contribute to this. We're going to need both parties to fix it. And so the solutions that I found, I just tried to follow the history and I tried to look for places where it seems like things could have been different. And the amazing thing was that as I found those moments where things could have been different, it really did point toward places where people who are on opposite sides of things can work together. So that's true of the left and the right of Democrats and Republicans. It's true of farmers and environmentalists. It's true of consumers of different stripes. These places where it feels like we have false choices is what I was trying to find, and what can we do about it? So one example is research and development. Research and development, funded by the private sector, funded by private universities, and funded by government, is at a massively difficult place right now. The government part of that is at the lowest level since the 1970s. Global productivity, total factor productivity, which is where you are producing more with fewer resources, you're getting more productive, is sliding globally. And America is a huge source of that drag. Traditionally, America has been a source of innovation, and America is actually an anchor on that right now, dragging it down. So what can we do if we were to reverse that? If we were to kick off an R&D revolution, what would that look like? Well, it would look like the companies, the big agribusiness companies out there that really direct a lot of our food economy and sell a lot of farmers their goods and buy a lot of farmers' goods, could be looking at how to utilize their research and development dollars in ways that would partner with small farms. What technologies can we have that can help small, medium-sized farms? They can partner with the large farms. They need to do that, of course, for economic of scale, but also for durability, as we talked about during COVID. If you want to have a durable supply chain that these companies can do business with, they need to have farms of all sizes. So focusing on R&D that can benefit small farms. And then if we were to get the government piece of that to come along, I think that people on the right side of the aisle might want to see more accountability with that spending, more transparency. I don't think the people on the left necessarily disagree with that goal. They want taxpayer dollars spent well. People on the left who want to bring more resources, I think that's something that people on the right can agree with when they see that this is something that can help with private sector innovation. So to give you some examples. Right now, there's a technology called gene editing. And what it does is it makes small adjustments to crops. And there's funny, ridiculous examples of it, like square watermelons that you might have seen and stuff like that. I'm not talking about that. What I'm talking about is the modern generation of what they did when they created hybrid corn, corn seed that could grow in more places. There's an ability to adjust the genes of seeds in small ways so that we can grow more crops in more places in more climates. So instead of having certain crops that can be grown only in certain parts of the world or certain parts of the country and shipped, we also have the ability to grow them and sell them locally. So you can open up more options. You can create more market opportunities for farmers, more cash crops for farms like ours when we're shifting from corn and hay to feed our cows to corn and hay to feed our animals, but also soybeans and also wheat, and trying to figure out if there's food products we could get into. If we were to utilize gene editing to open up those opportunities and find more types of crops that farmers could be buying and selling, well, think about that for consumers. Consumers would also have more choices for their food. And when we have the next disaster, you aren't just depending upon that one place to get all of your food. And if they don't have it, you're paying more or not getting it. And so gene editing is one example. AI is another example. There's an opportunity for scale neutral technology that doesn't just help with great big farm machinery, but also small farm machinery that can that can make small farms more efficient. There's all kinds of things. But what we need to do is, number one, we need to have more innovation in this country. We need to have more R&D spending in this country. And we need to make sure that this time it doesn't leave a big swath of our farms behind.
I thought I might wrap this part of the program up by asking you a question about the future. So this day is also, besides being the book launch day, which is a pretty big deal, this day 5 years ago, we buried my dad in southern Ohio, about 75 miles east of Cincinnati. Little town, Russellville, Ohio, Decatur, Ohio. And I have to tell you, you know, burying your father is not fun, but the area had been devastated. It was just, this was once a proud rural community, and people were struggling mightily. And it was frankly, it was deeply depressing. And we went, what happened? And so my question is, what will happen? I know you talk in the book about the fact that we need to revitalize rural communities. Do you think we can do that? Or are some of these places, like where my dad's buried, are they just sort of, they've seen their better days?
We can do it. It doesn't mean we can save every area, and it doesn't mean you can guarantee every small town any better than you can guarantee every farm, but we can do it. There are still 2 million farms in this country. 96% of them are family operations. And that means, and most of them, by the way, are small and medium-sized farms that are not the sole income for their family anymore. So because they couldn't make enough money on the farm, they're pouring concrete, they're pulling shifts at the factory, they're working construction jobs, and they're working a farm. So they're working 2 or 3 jobs, and the farm is one of them. What if every single one of those 2 million farms could be a growing entrepreneurial small business in this country again? That's 2 million farm families ready to feed America, create more ways for us to withstand disaster, bring down the cost of food, address our environmental problems, all kinds of things. And it's new opportunities for all of those families. I think that's possible with things like an R&D revolution and other things. And I think we're at a moment where we can do that, because COVID was a terrible thing in so many ways. One of the things that it did is it made people think more about where their food comes from, because people were out there not getting what they needed on the grocery store shelves. And maybe they heard about the ridiculous fact that farmers also couldn't find a place to sell the food. And it's like, can't we just get together here? You know? And so in the wake of COVID, when people care more about where their food comes from than ever before, when people care about whether it's local and fresh and healthy, and people are maybe worried about additives and all kinds of different things, there's all kinds of reasons that people care about this like they didn't before. And our economy is more mobile. People are able to live and work in more places because of the amount of remote work that can occur. That's more ideas, more money, more people flowing between the urban and rural economy. So I think we're in a moment where we can address it if we all decide we want to do that.
Thanks for the optimism. That's great. Let's take a few questions from the audience. Just raise your hand, stand up if you would. I think maybe that would help people hear you a little better. Let's start right here.
What I saw was when a big company in Texas bought up all the processors, and almost all the processors managed. And also here in this same company, we're both open. And so then what is the farmer going to do if they don't process their milk? And so that to be that. There are some small farms in Massachusetts where they do their own process. Well, and Wisconsin, the whole world so out, so spread out.
Yeah, Brian, you want to weigh in on this? No, no, just let it.
I've had some really young farms.
Yeah.
For a start, maybe they sell them.
Right. Right.
So I think the small farms.
Yeah. Yeah, I do think so. And I think that it'll take different forms, different places. There where you talked about the proximity being such that the farmer and the consumer could directly interact makes a lot of sense. The other thing is, as you said, there's places where that wouldn't always work. We don't have a market infrastructure between the farm gate and the dinner table that's more diverse than just the big distribution chains. And some of the big distribution chains, to be clear, are needed because our economy depends upon it. They got that way because they needed to compete. So I want to be honest about those realities. And they play a part. But we can also have a world where, you know, like right now, like if we wanted to go sell corn, we know where to go to. We got a local grain elevator that we can go sell traditional commodity crops, right? But if we, let's say we wanted to grow artisan tomatoes, well, my dad would look at me and say, well, where in the hell are we going to sell artisan tomatoes? You know, and the reality is that we have farms who can grow it and we have people who want to eat it. And if we have more of those people who want to eat it, we have more consumers going not just to their grocery store, which is a good thing to do, but also stopping by the local butcher shop, stopping by the local farm stand, pushing for bigger farmers markets in the area that have more food goods and are more affordable, and permanent outdoor markets and specialty food stores. If that's something that consumers in this country want, you can bet that the American system is going to deliver it for them. And so we need to have an ability for farms that can turn and sell commodity corn to have a place to also turn with specialty wheat and have that market infrastructure between the farmer and the consumer. And that's what's missing. And the consumer can drive that. That doesn't mean it's only on the consumer. It also means that farms have to be ready to innovate and our policymakers and others have to embrace this. But there's an ability to close that gap, I think, now more than ever.
Thanks for the question. Other questions? Yes.
Given that there's any site, if you had to make changes like tomorrow and then maybe midterm and long term, what would be the kinds of things that you'd expect or want to see happen?
Yeah, the first thing that would have to happen is that R&D investment has to happen now because to your point, it's not an immediate fix. It is an investment. It has to go immediately. But the other things that our country could do is as we're pursuing free trade, we're making sure that it's fair trade as well. This is something that actually people on the left and the right became very frustrated with free trade because they felt like it just wasn't shaking out for the American worker. It was the same thing for the American farmer. And I'm not making an anti-trade statement, but what I'm saying is as we're opening, there is an ability to open more markets worldwide where more goods that our farms are selling can have a higher price because they can go more places. We've really stopped doing that for the most part in this country. We haven't been doing that for the last several years because people lost faith in it. So if we can begin opening up more markets again so that there are more places to sell corn and soybeans and more places to be able to bring that price up, more demand, but do it in a way that is more nimble, that insists on tough enforcement that keeps countries from China like cheating this time. So if we can do it truly free and fair and open up new markets while protecting ourselves, not protectionism, but protecting ourselves against those that are cheating, that's something that could happen right now because there could be more places to sell crops and the ability to protect ourselves from some of the downsides of that. There's also antitrust things to make sure that our country isn't only having bigger companies in every single industry to the end of the earth, but that there's some common sense around that. That's something the left's talked about for a while. On the right, the reality is that you can believe in low taxes and less regulation. That doesn't mean you have to believe in companies that get so big they can restrict their own competition. So there's things like that that we can do. There's also a really good example, and then I'll pause. There's a really good example in Wisconsin of what we can do with the Master Cheesemaker program. So Wisconsin is the only state in the country that has a Master Cheesemaker program, which is to say it's basically like a doctorate in making cheese. And so our small cheese factories have that seal of approval, and the cheese is not only bought and sold here and loved here, but it's across the country. And it's part of the reason that we continue to lead in cheese production, even though California overtook us in milk production back in the 90s. That's an example of a regional rural economy that we can set up if we can find niches like that. And the reality is that in Wisconsin, we have more small and medium-sized farms in a lot of states that have lost them because we have more small and medium-sized cheese factories that buy the milk in addition to the larger dairy processors. Again, there's a place for all of these folks. But things like the Master Cheesemaker program, finding niches for states and for local communities and for regions of the country that can place some additional value on what it is the farmer is doing and get more varied products to the consumer, that's good for the farmer and it's good for the consumer.
Thank you very much for the question. Yes, sir.
Do you think climate change is having on your current situation?
Well, farmers live in that weather every day. And so they know that as things are changing in the climate, they know that extreme weather and other things are having an impact. We're seeing flooding, we're seeing other things like that. So, you know, it's a real challenge when the weather and the climate are changing and farmers are living through that. The thing that my mind goes to on that issue is the fact that farmers and environmentalists have so much that they can agree upon. And the problem with the debate in our country is that it pits farmer versus environmentalist when the truth is they've got much more in common than not, just in terms of how much they care about the land, they care about our resources. And for example, if we were to focus on the issue of soil quality, farmers want good soil quality that can yield a high amount of crops. Environmentalists want good soil quality that can help protect our health and other goals. We can focus on soil quality. We can focus on abundance of water. These are things that farmers and environmentalists want, where we don't have to have the two things be at odds. Unfortunately, in this country, you know, right now that conversation is something that often pits people who are concerned about the environment, well-intentioned people, against farmers who are well-intentioned people just trying to make a living. And so I think we can change that discussion, and I think it's a really important question you ask for that reason.
Maybe one final question? Yes, we'll go in the back row there.
That's a great question. I wish I had a better answer to that. What I can tell you is that the Farm Bill itself needs to undergo deep reform. And so the first thing I would say, there's probably a lot of good individual pieces of legislation, and I'd have to read up on the ones that you're talking about to speak to them more specifically. But on the Farm Bill, one of the most important things that we can do is we can tell our elected officials that their measure needs to be, what are you doing to create new opportunities for our farmers? As opposed to what are you doing to support our farmers? Because you can get both parties to say that they've supported our farmers. That's very easy to say. You hear that in every parade. You hear that on everybody that knocks on your door. But what are you doing to create new opportunities for our farmers? And the Farm Bill doesn't create a lot of new opportunities. You know, it protects a lot of the status quo and government programs that both the left and the right would criticize in different ways that we've kind of just piled on. And maybe one was good or the other was good, but they've all just piled on. And now they're kind of like one economist I talked to said it's a fragile Jenga tower, you know, and whether each block is good or not, they don't really fit together in a way that is going to stay standing. And so what we need to do is figure out if we're going to have, for example, subsidies in this country that provide some kind of a safety net for uncontrollable weather. You know, there's value in having a stable food supply so that when a hail crop comes through or a flood comes through, it wipes out a crop, doesn't wipe out the farm and wipes out that part of our food supply, because we would lose our food supply over time if we didn't have that. But once you have that basic safety net figured out, how do we reform the Farm Bill so that it can allow for more entrepreneurial opportunity where farmers are following more of what the market calls for, more of what consumers want, as opposed to government programs that, you know, the right might criticize spending, but I think the left gets just as frustrated seeing how much of that spending goes toward specific areas of the industry, certain industries, you know, picking winners and losers and things like that. So the first thing I would say is, how can we look at the Farm Bill to make it a piece of legislation that enables and clears the way for more entrepreneurship by our farms and more individual decisions by farmers and by consumers?
So we're going to close by saying that this is a big day. I mean, your first book, congratulations on that. But it's been a big year for you. When I talked to him on the phone the other day, I heard this cooing in the background, and I said, "Is that your daughter?" And he said, "Yeah." So tell us a little bit about, you know, the family life for Brian Reisinger today.
Yeah, thank you for asking. Believe it or not, the book is not the biggest thing that happened this year, not even by a long shot.
Tell your publisher that.
Yeah, that's right. My 5-month-old daughter Anna was born. She was named for my grandma, my dad's mom, as well as for my wife Rachel's abuelita on her side of the family. And so that was the biggest thing that's happened. And fatherhood has completely changed my life. Anybody who reads my columns in the Journal Sentinel, I see my editor, Jim Fitzhenry, back there, and I know Greg Browski's here too. They know that fatherhood has completely rocked my world. And so I actually have a little bit of a unique situation. My wife, Rachel, is from Northern California. And so of all places, we live in Northern California, and I split my time back and forth. And I feel very fortunate for that. People say, how can you do that? Well, I can't afford two places. I can't hardly afford one place in California. We rent an apartment in a small town there near her family. And then I split my time back and forth. I come back almost monthly, not quite, but almost monthly, with my work and my writing bringing me back here. And I stay on the farm when I'm at home. And the reason I say all that is to say that I'm very happy to report that Anna is a sturdy little traveler. She could care less if she's on solid ground or up in the airplane. And you know, when I hold her in my arms and we're flying, she has no idea the weight that she's carrying on her shoulders, making it possible for me to be back here. And so we're gonna have her back here. Maybe she'll turn up at one of these book events. So stay tuned, keep turning out. So.
Again, congratulations. The book is called Land Rich, Cash Poor, My Family's Hope and the Untold History of the Disappearing American Farmer. Brian Reisinger, great to be with you tonight.
I just want to thank everybody for coming, and thank Mike for joining me. I know I made the joke about writers and journalists not polling at 70%, but I'm pretty sure Mike Gousha polls north of 70, at least, especially in the Milwaukee area. So thank you, Mike.